There is a specific kind of silence that follows a funeral, a heavy, airless quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. But as I pulled my car onto Maple Creek Road, that silence was shattered by the sight of two vehicles that didn't belong. My sister-in-law's silver minivan was idling in the driveway, its left tail light still jagged and broken, a 3-year-old repair she'd been too lazy to handle. Parked behind it, like a territorial claim, was my brother-in-law's black pickup, its tires crushing the edge of the lawn I'd spent all spring weeding. I sat there with the engine running, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned a ghostly white. I had just come from Greenwood Cemetery. I still had the scent of fresh, damp earth clinging to my coat. Walter, my father-in-law, was finally resting, but looking at those cars, I realized the vultures hadn't even waited for the sun to set before they started circling. Have you ever felt like a stranger in the house where you've spent a decade of your life? I stared at the front door, wondering if the man I'd been married to for 31 years was already inside, deciding which parts of my life were worth throwing away. I let the engine die, but I didn't get out immediately. I needed a moment to shed the Dorothy who had stood at the graveside, the dutiful, stoic woman in the 11-year-old black coat. I remembered Walter's voice, raspy and thin from 3 weeks ago. "Don't you dare cry for me, Dorothy," he muttered, his eyes surprisingly sharp despite the morphine. "You've done your time. You just stand there and know you did right by me." I had done right by him. I knew that. But as I watched the front curtain twitch, I realized that doing right wasn't going to be enough to protect me from what was waiting on the other side of that door. When I stepped into the living room, the atmosphere was clinical. It didn't smell like a house in mourning, it smelled like a boardroom. My husband, the man whose children I'd raised and whose secrets I'd kept for 3 decades, was perched in Walter's favorite armchair. It felt like a sacrilege. That chair still held the shape of a man who actually stood for something. My sister-in-law, Renee, sat on the edge of the sofa, her arms locked across her chest, as if she were bracing for a physical blow. Her husband, Gary, was there too, pretending to be fascinated by the wood grain of the mantel, but it was the stranger in the corner who made my blood run cold. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car, holding a leather portfolio with the practiced indifference of a man who makes his living from other people's tragedies. "Shut the door, Dorothy," my husband said. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't even use my name with any warmth. It was a command. "I think I'll stay standing," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I could feel the mud from the cemetery drying on my heels. "It's been a long day, and I'm not sure I want to get comfortable for whatever this is." The stranger cleared his throat. He was an attorney, but not our family lawyer. He was someone Dennis, my brother-in-law, had retained for the transition. Transition. What a polite word for an eviction. They began to talk about Walter's estate as if he were a pile of scrap metal instead of a man who had loved this land since 1971. The house, the savings, the truck, the Tennessee acreage, everything was being carved up into 3 neat equal piles. My husband shifted in that stolen chair, finally looking at me, though his eyes were empty. "The market is peaking right now, Dorothy," he said, and I realized he'd been rehearsing this line while I was picking out Walter's burial suit. "We've all talked it over. Renee and Dennis need their liquidity. We're going to list the house next week. We think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay while we get it staged." The room seemed to shrink. Does 31 years of marriage really have a shelf life? Can you truly spend 3 decades building a life with someone, only to have them treat you like an inconvenient tenant the moment a paycheck is involved? I looked at Renee, who wouldn't meet my gaze. I looked at my husband, who was already mentally spending his share of the loot. "You've already spoken to a realtor?" I asked. The kettle in the kitchen began a low, mournful hum, signaling it was nearly at a boil. "It's just logistics," Renee piped up, her voice tight. "We have to move forward. We've had a lot of time to think about this." "How much time?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. "Because we buried him 4 hours ago. Were you discussing the commission while the pastor was reading the 23rd Psalm, or did you wait until the first shovelful of dirt hit the casket?" The silence that followed was oily and thick. I didn't wait for an answer. I walked into the kitchen, the one place in this house that still felt like mine. I needed the heat of the stove. I needed the mundane ritual of making tea to keep from screaming. As I stood there watching the steam rise, I looked out the window at the garden. I thought about the 9 years I'd spent in this house. My husband saw a real estate asset, but I saw the ghosts of 1,000 Tuesdays. I saw the spot on the lawn where I'd held Walter's arm during his first walk after the stroke. I saw the vegetable beds where we'd planted tomatoes even when his hands were too shaky to hold the seeds. Loneliness makes dangerous choices feel reasonable, and 9 years ago, moving in here had felt like the right choice. But as I heard the low murmur of the vultures in the next room, I realized that while I was busy caring for the dying, my husband had been busy planning for the aftermath. My husband had his golf, his Friday nights with Dennis, his career. I had the medications. I had the vascular dementia, that cruel thief that makes the person you love look at you like you're a trespassing ghost. I had the baths. Have you ever had to wash the back of a man who used to be a giant trying to preserve his dignity while he cries because he can't remember how to use a washcloth? That wasn't logistics. That was my life. I took my tea and went upstairs without another word to them. I needed to be away from the smell of their greed. In our bedroom, no, my bedroom, I saw the small cardboard box on the nightstand. Walter had given it to me 6 weeks ago. Open it after they've had their say, he'd whispered. I had kept that promise. I had kept it through the hospice vigils and the long silent nights when the only sound in the house was Walter's labored breathing. I sat on the edge of the bed and peeled back the brown packing tape. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Inside, there were envelopes. One was addressed to a law firm in Nashville, a name I didn't recognize. Another had my name on it, written in Walter's deliberate blocky print, and at the bottom, a photograph of his late wife, Grace. She was laughing, her hair caught in a 1960s breeze. I opened my letter first. It wasn't a long-winded apology. Walter wasn't a man of many words, but the ones he chose hit like a sledgehammer. He wrote that he wasn't blind. He had watched his own children for years. He had seen who showed up for the hard parts and who only showed up for the holidays. He knew that the moment his heart stopped, his children would look at this house and see nothing but dollar signs. Dorothy, he wrote, you stayed. When everyone else had somewhere more important to be, you showed up every single day. That counts for everything. I felt a sob catch in my throat, but I forced myself to keep reading. He had contacted a firm in Nashville 18 months ago. He had bypassed the family attorney entirely. He had executed something called a transfer on death deed. In our state, that meant the moment he drew his last breath, the title of this house didn't go into a pot to be divided. It didn't go to his children. It came to me. The house wasn't an estate asset. It was mine. The deed was already recorded at the county clerk's office. There was no probate. There was no liquidity for Renee. There was no staging for my husband. He had even sold off that Tennessee land 2 years ago and put the proceeds into a private account in my name alone. He had built me a fortress while I was too busy being a servant to notice. I sat there in the fading light holding that letter, and for the first time in 9 years, I felt like I could breathe. I realized then that desire whispers louder than guilt, and my husband's desire for a payday had totally blinded him to the fact that his father had seen right through him. I went downstairs. The meeting was breaking up. The attorney was packing his leather portfolio. My husband looked at me with a patronizing sort of pity. We'll talk more tomorrow, Dorothy. Give you some time to process. Oh, I've processed plenty, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. And you're right. Everyone should leave. Now. Dorothy, don't be difficult, Renee started, but I cut her off with a look that made her freeze. The house isn't for sale, I said, and the decision about the living situation has already been made. I'm staying, and since I'm the sole owner of this property as of 4 hours ago, I'd like you all to take your logistics and get out of my driveway. The confusion on their faces was a tonic. My husband started to laugh, a nervous, jagged sound. The will doesn't cover the house, I interrupted. Walter took care of that 14 months ago. I have the recorded deed upstairs. I have the firm in Nashville on speed dial. If you want to contest it, you can try. But Walter was very thorough. He wanted to make sure that the person who actually lived in this house got to keep it. I watched my husband deflate. That's the only word for it. He didn't explode. He didn't rage. He just sat back down in Walter's chair and looked like a man who had tried to cheat at a game he didn't realize he'd already lost. He looked at me, and for the first time in 31 years, I saw him clearly. He wasn't a partner. He was a passenger. He always liked you better, he muttered. He didn't like me better, I said, leaning against the doorframe. He just saw me. There's a difference. The next few months were a blur of legal paperwork and cold silences. My husband moved into Dennis's spare room, and we began the slow, painful surgery of ending a 3-decade marriage. It wasn't clean. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the house felt so large and empty that I thought the walls might collapse in on me. My children called with complicated feelings, but I stood my ground. I wasn't being cruel. I was finally being honest. I remember one Thursday evening, about 6 weeks into my new life. The sun was dipping low, turning the backyard into a sea of liquid gold. I walked out to the bird feeder, the one Walter made me promise to fill every Thursday. As I poured the sunflower seeds, I felt a strange sense of equilibrium. I wasn't just the caregiver anymore. I wasn't the wife. I was Dorothy. I think about that photo of Grace often. I keep it taped inside the kitchen cabinet, right next to the coffee mugs. Below it is the last line of Walter's letter. You were more family to me than most of my family ever managed to be. It's a reminder that loyalty isn't about blood. It's about who stays when the room gets dark. I'm still learning how to cook for one. I'm still learning how to sleep in the middle of a king-size bed. But every Thursday without fail, I fill that bird feeder. And every morning, when the light hits that old linoleum, I drink my coffee in a house that finally, truly belongs to me. If you've ever felt like your hard work was being ignored by the people who should love you most, remember that someone is always watching. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the power. If this story moved you or made you think about the vultures in your own life, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us tell more stories about the hidden strength of women like Dorothy. What would you have done if you found that box? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Would you like me to tell you what happened when Renee tried to sue for the Tennessee land?